Hey everyone, Phil here. I just want to introduce you to this new section on the camera. In this section, you're going to be learning what a camera is, the different types of cameras, and all the different aspects of a camera. It's very important in this cinematography class to learn what the camera is and how it works, whether you're using a smartphone, a DSLR, mirrorless, or a bigger cinema-style digital camera. So get excited and I'll pass it over to Will.
So welcome to this section about cameras. We're really just going to talk everything camera in this section. What the camera is, what it does, and everything that encompasses this tool that we're going to be using. Probably the main tool of what we're talking about. So a little over 100 years ago, film was invented, movie imagery, moving images based off of film. Up until about the last decade or so, we had used film for everything. Maybe we started getting into video for TV and stuff like that, but really, it's really been in the last decade or two where we've kind of started to move into digital imagery. For this course, we're going to kind of specifically lean towards digital. Obviously, this is the medium that everything's leaning towards. Film is not really used as much anymore. It is really important to film history that you understand how to expose film, because everything that is talked about digitally comes from how to expose film. So we're talking about ISO, we're talking about frame rate, we're talking about shutters that used to be used in old film cameras. Everything that we use technically in terms comes from how to expose film. The big difference is, obviously, in emulsion, where it's chemical based and analog, so to speak, versus digital. Digital is going to be those chips with pixels, RGB, that we're exposing and having light photons react digitally as opposed to chemically. So that's the big difference. Another big difference is, and why they've kind of waited to move from film to digital, is latitude, and really where you can expose the shadows and where you can expose the highlights. Typically, film had always won. Film had always been able to expose more, and I think there still might be a little bit of an argument that it still does, but digital has gotten to a place where cinematographers and filmmakers, based on budgets, based on time, have been able to use digital as the mainstream way of capturing imagery. So we're going to focus on that. Another reason for digital is because that's the workflow. Typically, olden days with film, you'd shoot something on film, you'd expose it correctly, then you'd have to go develop it, and then because of the digital age, you'd have to scan it and then edit it faster, because post is able to edit, obviously, digital much faster than cutting up film and moving things together and having reels hang everywhere. Now with digital, you just go right into the computer and you can edit on your computer immediately from the camera, or you can be editing it live, or you can be editing on your phone. So really, digital's been moving us in that direction. I think it's caught up to it as far as basic videoing, and it's become much easier and cheaper. So really, that's why digital has kind of taken over. So because digital imagery has become so good as of late, we're going to be referring to just digital stuff, because that's typically what all of you guys will be using. So keep in mind, for the rest of the course, I'll be referring to resolution, chip size, all that stuff digitally. But also keep in mind that all of that stuff derives from film. So if you know film, if you learn film, it should be an easy transition into digital, as long as you kind of remember what we're doing here. So I want to talk about DSLRs versus cinema cameras. I think there's been a really big trend in the last 5+ years where DSLRs have really made a huge impact, mostly because they're cheaper and they still get you that look that you're looking for. And that look I'm talking about is the high definition, the 24 frames per second, as well as the kind of depth of focus that we're looking for that you get with interchangeable lenses. So let's talk about DSLR versus cinema cameras, or bigger, more video camera-esque things. DSLRs really come from a world of photography. So you got to keep in mind that these DSLR cameras, while they do shoot great video, they were meant for photography. So a lot of times there are little tiny instances where they might not get you the most perfect video. I'm talking about when you're using DSLR lenses, they may breathe, which means when you focus, they tend to zoom in and out. There's other instances where you're moving quickly, the jelly effect, where you see things maybe move sideways because the processors just can't keep up with the amount of information that's coming in. Those are tiny little instances that DSLRs have. Along with, they're just really hard to see, the little tiny screens, and also they're just smaller and they get a shake to them. So those are DSLRs. While they're cheap, they have interchangeable lenses, they're a really good way to get that look for a lower price, and they're small. So when you take those and you verse them up against a cinema camera, something a little more like a bigger RED camera, or let's say a dock camera like a Sony FS7, or even a Canon C100 or a Canon C300, those are really meant for video. So the big difference is that those are meant for video. They may or may not have ND filters, which we can talk about later. They will have interchangeable lenses. They'll have inputs for sound like XLR straight in. And so there's a big difference in like battery length, battery time, imagery coloring. A lot of these bigger cinema cameras will let you shoot it raw, or they'll let you shoot with a look where you can capture more latitude, much more similar to film, as opposed to DSLRs, which you can hack and mess with and get that look eventually, but out of the box, they're really not going to get you the immense amount of light and perfection that you can from bigger cinema cameras. I know there's a big debate because there's definitely a lot of people that love their DSLRs and they shoot fantastic video, and I will always defer back to, it's always about the camera person, not the camera, because whatever tool you have, you can make work, and you will make work the best way you can as an artist. But as a cinematographer and a professional, I would prefer to move away from the DSLR game and move more into the cinema game. Another thing that's worth talking about that's coming up are mirrorless cameras. So those don't have those DSLR, those single lens reflexes. They are just straight up chips, which are sort of like the cinema cameras, but a little bit smaller packed. We're talking about the Sony a7S or the Sony a7R or the Panasonic Luminex GH4. Those are the two that are really making waves right now. So really when you're looking at purchasing a camera or renting a camera, those differences between those three types of camera, DSLR, cinema cameras, and mirrorless cameras, there are very subtle differences, but they can affect your project. So again, you just got to remember, what are you looking for? Sensitivity, ISO, frame rate, the ability to change lenses. Do you need sound? There's a ton of different variables, so just make sure you figure out what you need, and then you pick out the camera that you need for that specific project. Okay, so let's talk about resolution. This is very important because this will set your basis for the rest of the project. Let's start off with what exactly is resolution. Resolution is the exact pixel by pixel dimension of the chip that is inside your camera that you may be or may not be shooting at, right? So we look at that resolution, and that translates over to how you're going to view it. Your standard HD TV is 1920 by 1080. That's like the standard cable television that's pumping out now HD signal, and that's high definition. We've kind of forgotten about standard definition. Those cameras are out of date. You need to get on the HD train because that's where everything's moving. We're talking YouTube, we're talking the internet, we're talking Vimeo, we're talking your TV at home, you're talking your Blu-ray disc. Now, just to take a second, DVDs, old TVs, some low-resolution websites, and some older computers are not going to be at that high-definition standard, which is now, again, 1920 by 1080. Get that in your head because that is the main resolution that we're talking about. Typically, DSLR video cameras, which a lot of you will probably be starting out on, will shoot 1920 by 1080. At 24 frames per second, or 23.98, or 60 frames per second. We'll talk more about frame rate later, but let's stick on resolution. The big thing to remember is that as you grow in cinema and as you grow in cameras, the resolution will get higher. TVs are now getting bigger. So let's go from 1920 to 1080. What's the next common step? It's called 2K, which is 2000 something by something, which is a really not much bigger than a 1920 by 1080, but it's sort of been a selling point for a lot of different projects. GoPro was one of the first consumer cameras that started shooting at 2K. So that typically isn't really popping. People have gone from 1920 and they've skyrocketed to 4K. 4K is 4096 by 2160 pixels. Again, that's down and across. So that's a big image. And that reason why is there's more pixels, there's more detail in your image. And you can see that it's just much clearer. As opposed to 1920 by 1080, there's more pixels, more definition. It's kind of the way you would look at a painting, right? If there's more strokes and more fine detail, the more you're going to be able to see the detail of the entire piece, as opposed to broader, less strokes, it's going to be a little fuzzier. Now in painting, that's a look, but for TV and for video to match your eye, the higher the amount of pixels, the more dense, the more detail that we'll see, and that's what they're calling high definition. Chances are the cameras that we're shooting on are not going to be necessarily 4K, and also chances are the people that you're going to be showing this footage to are not going to have a 4K TV to project that full amount of resolution. Maybe if you're projecting in the theater like AMC or something like that, but typically you're not going to be that high of a resolution. Now, why would we shoot in 4K? Because a lot of professionals are shooting in 4K and often even 6K. Because you get that resolution, you get that room. So imagine if we shoot right here, we shoot this much space, right? This is maybe a 4K shooting, but we're really going to project it at this big, right? A 1080 TV. That's much less pixels than this. So we shoot this much. That means we can take this image and we can zoom in that much without losing definition on our final project. So that's really why we would shoot a higher resolution when we can, and then be able to project it at a lower resolution and be able to really kind of just get that detail or reframe that shot or maybe move that shot left or right without losing definition. 4K cameras are getting cheaper and cheaper. There's some smaller Sonys and Panasonics that are going to be a little more cheaper that you can shoot 4K on. They're mirrorless cameras, which we can talk about later. But chances are, if you're going to shoot 4K, that means it's going to take up more card space. That's going to take up more computer space when you do post, and it's going to require a much beefier system to run through all of that stuff and edit it and output it. So for now, I would say if you're starting out to do cinematography and you're investing in a camera, investing in post work and really getting out there, 1920 by 1080 is your best bet. If you can rent a higher quality camera, maybe a small Sony mirrorless camera, or if you have enough budget to get a Red or an ARRI or any of those bigger Alexas or anything like that, shoot a bigger resolution if you've got the bandwidth, because you always want to get as much detail and as much resolution as you can. The future of high definition is kind of up in the air. I think in about a few years, people are going to be moving to 4K TVs, but typically everything's in step and step and step, mostly because companies need to sell you as much as they can and then move on to the next it thing. The next it thing will be 4K. 3D has kind of fallen off, I think, a little bit. After 4K in a few years, 5 years, we'll probably get to 6K, and it'll just keep going. I think the eye kind of is settling around 2K, 4K as far as what we can see. It's kind of an unknown right now. I think a lot of people are not necessarily moving towards resolution, but moving more towards high dynamic range, which means being able to see in the shadows and see in the brights. So I think there might be some trends in cameras moving towards sensitivity and stuff like that as opposed to resolution, but you need to know what resolution is in order to get the rest of your camera and cinematography moving. So we just talked about resolution. Now let's talk about frame rate. Frame rate is frames per second. You'll often see this as FPS. When you're talking about cinematography or video, what you're actually doing is taking multiple images and running them up and speeding them up to make it look like a video, right? So that's how they figured out video and cinematography. They took a ton of photos, moved them really fast, kind of like animation, and they turned into a moving image. So what's the aesthetic, or what's the amount of frames that needs to pass in front to make it look good? Well, it was kind of set up back in the early 1900s that 24 frames per second was sort of the standard that moved well to the eye, as well as their mechanical machines in the old film cameras. That means that every second there's 24 frames passing in front of your lens, right? Just like that. So that aesthetic became the standard for frame rate playback when it played through a projector. So the projector would also then take that same film and run 24 frames a second to mimic the exact amount of light that it captured in the moment. When we moved into television, the video aspect, they seemed to kind of like a different look, and it became 30 frames per second. Generally, most TV, when TV started, and newscasts would project and would also film at 30 frames per second, which gave you 6 more frames, which I think is kind of odd, you're probably thinking, but it makes it a different look. Like if you look at a television and you go watch a movie in the theater, there's definitely a different look, and you can kind of tell the refresh rate or the reality rate is a little slower in movies, and that's because the frame rate is 24 versus 30. When you watch a CNN newscast, that's at 30. So you can kind of see the difference as far as look. And it's kind of hard to explain, you kind of have to look at it. I think you'd understand when you're looking at it. So as we move into the digital age, we've really kind of settled in 24 frames per second as the standard movie aesthetic. For some reason, we've all kind of come used to that. We like that. That's our magical point for really cinema and movies. A lot of TV shows, like shows on HBO, Game of Thrones, stuff like that, they shoot at 24. So you can kind of tell the difference between a sitcom, which would shoot at 30, versus a film that shoots at 24. So when you take your project, you have to decide where you're going to be shooting. If you're shooting an interview for television or something like that, you might want to stick to 30. If your look is more cinema and you want it to look a little more dynamic as far as aesthetic and movie and magic, 24 frames is where you're going to be at. So let's talk about your digital camera. You need to go and find the selection to do that. A lot of cameras, smaller DSLRs, will actually shoot at true 24 frames per second. But because of digital numbers and ones and zeros that I'm not going to get too deep into, it's also referred to as 2398 or 23976, which could really means it's dropping a little tiny frame, but we'll get into that maybe some other time. So if you're looking for 24, it could be under 2398 or true 24. All cameras are different. You might not know what your camera is, so you have to look and make sure that you select one of those. The same goes for 30 frames per second. If your camera will do true 30, select that. If it won't do true 30, it'll probably say 2997. So you'll have to pick one of those and decide which one. 2997 and 30 frames per second are the same thing as far as you're concerned, as far as digital goes. Just make sure you're consistent across the board. If you're going to shoot in one frame rate, you need to stay on that frame rate unless you're going to do some slow motion stuff. We'll get to that in a second. But you need to stay on that frame rate, and your post workflow also needs to reflect that. So when you're editing, you need to make sure your time is set up as the frame rate that you shot on. Now, if you want to do slow motion, there are other frame rates. When you take 24 or 30 and you try and slow it down, you're going to see a little skipping digitally. You might see some artifacts and stuff like that. That's because there's just not enough frames to show the slowing down. And you're taking images and you're slowing them down, so you'll start to see that kind of tick because there's just not enough frames. So how would you shoot slow motion? You need to add more frames in so that when you slow it down and you're playing it back at 24, you see those added frames to keep that nice kind of fluid movement. So there's a couple of standard steps as far as frame rate goes. The next step from 24 would be 60 frames per second. And really at that point, you're adding in more frames so that when you slow it down, you see those extra frames and you can see that nice buttery movement. 60 frames per second or 5994 is really those two standards, digital and true 60. So if you pick that, you have to then take that image you're shooting at, that frame rate. In post, you want to slow that down and interpret it or look at it as if it was 24. So you shoot in 60 to get that extra frames, but then tell the computer and the TV to look at it at 24. And that will really affect and give you a nice, smooth slow motion. Not all cameras will shoot at 60 frames per second. In fact, some cameras will only shoot at 60 frames per second if you drop your resolution down. So if you're shooting at 1920 by 1080, it'll drop you down to 1280 by 720, and you'll be able to shoot 60 frames per second, but your resolution just went down. So you kind of have to pick and choose how you're going to shoot on those types of cameras. Other cameras, newer cameras like the C300 Mark II will let you shoot at 60 frames per second at 1920 by 1080. The older C100 will only let you shoot at, will not even let you shoot at 60 frames per second, I think. So you kind of have to figure out which camera you want and what you're going to shoot at. If you're tending to do a lot of music videos and sports stuff that you want slow motion at, you might want to look into a camera that shoots at a higher frame rate. If you're not worried about that, all the other cameras will shoot at 24, they'll shoot at 30, they'll shoot at your standard definition. It just depends on what your project is and what frame rate you're really going for. So I want to talk a little bit about lenses. Now let's just go back to the big movie look, that aesthetic of movies, that like widescreen, that high resolution, that 24 frames per second, but also there's the look of the lens, right? So lenses really allow you to get that shallow depth of field to make something really in focus and make the rest really out of focus. And that's really what's kind of defined the DSLR and the film movement in the last 5 to 10 years, which is making your really low budget films look like big productions, big movies. And lenses and that depth of focus is what makes it look big, nice, fun, aesthetic to really look like movies. I would say that the interchangeable lens has really turned the digital market into that. Now that we can have interchangeable lenses and shoot video on DSLRs, on cinema cameras, you're able to achieve that look for relatively inexpensive. So what lenses are we really using? Well, there's multiple lenses. This right here is a Canon 24-70. It's kind of their standard zoom. It's the older version. But because of this, we're able to zoom in and zoom out and really get that nice, crisp depth of focus, shooting at a 2.8, which we'll get into more later. But because of this interchangeable lens, we're able to make it look like that. You can have a zoom, you can have prime lenses, which are just fixed aspects, so like 50 millimeters, 35 millimeters, 85 millimeters, 100 millimeters, and those won't let you zoom, but they will give you that greater depth. which will look like a movie. Now you got to keep in mind that there are DSLR photo lenses and there are cinema lenses. The big difference with that is that the DSLR film lenses tend to have filaments that will actually breathe. I mentioned that earlier, but when you try to focus, you'll see the millimeters or the zoom moving in and out, which could change your composition. That might not be what you're wanting to use, whereas a cinema lens will typically be more expensive, harder to find, and will not do that. They'll also tend to have rings here for a follow focus where a first AC or someone could be pulling focus for you. So that's the really big difference in cinema and DSLR lenses. I think the big thing to remember is, again, to remember to look at your project. What are you trying to do? Are you doing a doc where you need to be able to zoom and zoom out depending on the situation? Or are you shooting a film or a commercial where you'll have a set of lenses and you'll have time to switch from a prime lens to a zoom lens or whatnot? Or do you have a big budget and a ton of money where you can get a Fujinon giant zoom lens that's this big that never breathes and you can shift all day if you like without having to move it? It really depends on your project. The big thing to take away here is that whatever that's going through the glass is going to change the look immensely. All lenses have a different look, whether it be crisp or circles of confusion, which means the kind of way the stuff looks out of focus. Recently, Nikon lenses I've been noticing have kind of this really big bokeh, when it's out of focus, it looks nice and fuzzy. Whereas like a Canon lens, when it's out of focus, looks a little more crisp out of focus, which is kind of an oxymoron, but you kind of got to look at all around what the certain glass and filaments do to your image. There's a ton of things that happens once light goes through a lens. And so every lens is different, every lens has its own signature, and really that's going to affect your look, I think, more than anything else. The other thing is lenses are a great thing to invest in. You're not really going to get much different resolution out of this. This is always going to be glass. It's always going to be physical. Some have autofocus, manual focus, so those changes are different. But really, it's a great thing to invest in. You can always interchange them depending on the camera system you're in. So as far as investing in lenses, a really good example of this is the Canon 70-200. I never really purchased it, although I probably should have at this point in my life. But I've used the Canon 70-200 L series on photography cameras for weddings. I've used it on DSLRs to shoot a ton of different stuff. I've used it on Canon C100s and C300s. I've used it on a RedCam. I've used it on a Sony F5, which are big cinema cameras. That lens has really been able to carry across an entire sort of spectrum of different types of video cameras. These will really last you on any camera as long as you have the right mount. So all those cameras I mentioned will have an EF mount for that particular lens. I do have some Nikon lens primes that I use. I have an 85 1.8 that I have a Nikon to Canon adapter that I will bring on set and use on also the same types of cameras. So really, like, the lens investment is kind of a cool thing where you can use it across tons of different cameras. Another thing to mention is the speed of the lenses. That 2.8 will also get you that really good focus. The more wide open you get, the more shallowness you'll be able to achieve. If you do a 1.8 or a 2.8 f-stop, the more will be out of focus and the less in focus, and that's really that look. DSLRs tend to do that because of just their chips, but if you remember from your photography knowledge, opening up lets more light in, it's faster, that lens is going to be more expensive, as well as it's going to have more of that look. If you close down, more things will be in focus and things will be sharper. Also, you'll let less light in. So you got to keep that in mind when you're getting lenses. Again, lenses that are faster, which means light will come in, means that it will be more expensive because that's hard to achieve as far as physically. So 1.8s, 2.8s, 1.4 primes would probably be some of the more expensive glass. When you're talking about zooms, a 24-70, a 70-200, an 18-100, if it's at 2.8, is going to be a pretty expensive lens. But if you need that for your project, you're shooting at night, your camera doesn't handle sensitivity very well, you're going to want a faster lens. If you're shooting outside during the day, it's bright light, you're going to need an ND filter anyway. But if you want to achieve that look, you still want to shoot at like a 4.56 2.8. You want to open up so you achieve that cinema look. You'll probably need filters. You just got to be aware of what you're shooting. So again, the takeaway, lenses are a great investment. Remember to figure out what you need specifically for your project. If you're zooming out, if you can run away with primes, if you need a fast lens, if you don't need a fast lens, if it fits your camera system, if you need a matte box to cut out flares and put filters in. A lot of variables. Remember, project first, and then figuring out what you need exactly for that project.
Hey, Phil here, and I hope you're enjoying this class. If you're interested in learning more or taking your video production to the next level, have you checked out videoschoolonline.com, my website, yet? We have tons of great resources, guides, and all kinds of tips there to help you out. So if you go over to videoschoolonline.com, which you see now on the screen, click that blog article in the top of the page, you'll see all of our latest articles. So we have all kinds of stuff like choosing the right microphone for your video, how to choose the right camera for your video production, all the equipment you need to make awesome videos, a recent article about equipment list for making videos with your smartphone. These are all of our latest articles. If you click this link right here at the top of the blog, you'll go to an archive of all of our articles that's broken down in an easy way to find out what you're looking for. So if you scroll past the photography articles, you might be interested in some of those, but you can also see we have a ton of video production articles on everything from production to audio recording, post-production, the business side of video and filmmaking, and we're constantly adding and updating this list with our recent articles. And yeah, like I said, just check out videoschoolonline.com, go to the blog where we have our latest articles. A lot of these topics come from students like you who ask us questions, and we think, oh, well, there's probably a lot of students that are interested in that topic. So we'll go ahead and actually make an article or a guide there. So again, videoschoolonline.com, click the blog, click the link at the top of the blog to get to this page, which is an archive of all of our articles in a nice, neat way to find and easy to see. Anyways, I hope you're enjoying this class. Have a beautiful day and continue learning. Bye now.
So memory cards. Again, tons of variables as far as memory cards go. Really, you got to start with what camera you're going to use. Make sure you know what kind of card your camera takes. Typically, the most standard cards are either SD cards or compact flash cards. It really depends on the type of camera you're using, because even Sony, most bigger Sony cameras like the FS7, the F5, the F55, they take their own proprietary Sony cards. So you got to remember if you need to rent that extra for that camera, or what DSLR you're shooting on. The older DSLRs or the bigger, more expensive DSLRs will usually take CF cards, whereas the newer, smaller, younger DSLRs will end up taking SD cards. It really kind of depends on what you're doing. They're all flash-based, so that's good. Another thing to remember is really just the write speed of your card. You need to make sure you get something that's fast. I would always recommend at least 60 megabytes a second. This was a 64 gig at 95 megabytes per second. This one's a little bit slower at 60 megabytes per second at 32 gigs for a CF card. But you got to figure out what camera you're using, how fast it needs to write, how much you're going to record, and what your project is. You need a lot of cards. Can you fill everything up on one card? Can you spread it across multiple cards? You want to put all your eggs in one basket. You got to really figure out what your project is and how many cards you're going to need. You could also download on set, have a DIT. It depends on the level of what you're shooting at. I really like the C100 here that we're shooting on. It does take SD cards, and I usually stick to 64 gig, 95 megabytes per second card, which will last me all day. I've shot a wedding on them before, and it will kill. I'll never have to replace the cards all day. Which is great. I've also shot narratives where we'll shoot on smaller cards so that we can keep rolling and take them out, dump them so we can use the footage, play with the lights on the computer so we see what's going on. So it kind of depends on the project you're doing. The big thing to take away is that you make sure you have enough space and it's fast enough for this particular camera that you're using. I don't want to get into all the details of all the cameras because every camera is different. You really have to research how many megabytes per second your camera is advised at taking and how much you're going to shoot. Remember to go back to the resolution. Are you shooting 1920 by 1080 or are you shooting 4K, which is going to eat up tons more space because it's twice the amount of information. So just remember what you're shooting, figure that out, and then figure your card situation out. So I use the term latitude a couple times, and basically when we're going back to what we talked about film versus digital, latitude is the amount of range that you can get exposing correctly without losing information in the shadows and the highlights. Now, film is known to have a large latitude, which means it may have up to 13, 14 stops of range. So if you shoot at a mid-level f-stop, let's just say at an 11, you'll still have information in 2.8 and you'll still have information at 22. And that's having to do with exposure in the highlights and the shadows. Now remember, different cameras have different ranges of latitude. DSLRs may be a smaller latitude, which means around your base f-stop or exposure, you'll only be able to see into the shadows in the dark only so far in f-stop range. Whereas a bigger camera with a more sensitive sensor, you'll be able to have a larger range, a larger latitude, where you'll be able to see deeper into the highlights and see deeper into the shadows. So I refer to it a couple times. It really has to do with exposure and where you're going to really land as far as exposing your film and how far you can stretch it into that zebras or into the clipping or into the shadows.
Hey everyone, welcome to the first practice challenge for this course. We want to challenge you to do something and to take action throughout this course, because it's one thing to be listening to these great lessons by Will and to kind of follow along and take in all the information, but it's another step and it will help you learn by going out and actually taking action. Now in this section, we just learned about the camera, what it is, and so there's not really much we can ask you to do. We're not shooting yet. So our challenge today is to put together your camera kit. Whether you have just a phone or if you are thinking about getting a DSLR or other type of camera, get that purchase, rent it if you want to try it out, test out different lenses, and find a camera that you like. We're all about the tool is just a tool. The camera is just a tool. Brands, while they matter to a lot of people, and they do matter to us, I know I'm a Canon fan, Will is more of a Nikon fan in terms of DSLR style cameras. I know Will uses a lot of Sony cameras now for bigger productions and the Red Arri cameras as well. But for you, it doesn't really matter, because as a new cinematographer, you just have to get out there and start shooting. So get your camera together, because in the next section, when we start to learn about exposure and how to manually expose your image, we will ask you to take action using whatever camera you have. And it's important to have a camera to be able to take action and to learn and to become a better cinematographer. So your challenge today, get your camera equipment together, because in the next section, we got a fun challenge for you. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next section.
So I have here my friend Caleb, and he's about to go shoot some stuff, and he had some questions because he's never actually shot with this camera before. This is a Sony FS7, and I wanted to just use it as a camera to kind of go over with and interact with Caleb, so if he had any questions about it, we could kind of go over it and figure out the ergonomics of it, what he should be looking for, what are all the basic settings, stuff like that. Now, it's very similar to any other camera that you might be working with. It's sort of a mid-range videographer dock camera. A lot of it's going to be different than any other camera you might have, but the basics are there. The basic buttons, the basic menus, the inputs, the ergonomics, those are things that you can find on any camera. They're just maybe a little different, but you still got to be aware of where they are and what their functionality is. You ready?
Ready.
So what exactly are you planning on shooting?
So I'm going to be shooting a docu-commercial. So it's a little bit of a documentary and some glamour shots here and there to make it pop out, not make it your average documentary.
So you're trying to shoot a documentary that's going to look more commercial and look prettier and stuff like that. Okay, well let's just go over like the basics of the camera. I know you've shot before, but you haven't necessarily messed with this camera. Basically, obviously you got here the lens. There's a lens release up here. It looks like you actually rented a Metabones. So this actual F7 is not equipped with an EF mount for a Canon lens. So you got an adapter to then adapt it to a Canon lens. Very cool. So I'm just going to spin around here so we can show the cameras here. But when you're setting up, all your basic functions are here. You can see this big dial right here is going to be where you change your ND filters. You can hear it click, they're physical NDs. It's cool, the FS7 has like actual names for it, so you can actually see what they are, and you can hear it. Down here, it looks like you have a focus push button. That'll like help you do autofocus, and like you can kind of see. S&Q is really cool on the FS7. It's a fast way to get to speed and quality. Mm-hmm. So you can change like the speed of your frame rate, or you can change the quality as far as resolution goes and stuff like that. Iris will let you see how there's a little line there. It took me forever to figure this out on this camera, but this is where you change the f-stop.
Yes.
Yeah. So like, yeah, I'm sure you messed with that a little bit. But yeah, it took me forever. Sometimes it's up here and this will work too, but typically a quick way to know is that's where you're gonna change the f-stop. You can hold that and turn it off, and that'll, if you push that, that'll keep you from bumping it if you're set.
Gotcha.
I'll turn that off. Something we haven't talked about in this class, but the L, M, and H are low, medium, high for gain. Within the camera, you can set that to ISO. So you can put low being 200, you can set medium to like 600, and you can set high to be like 1200. So when you're running and gunning, you can easily switch ISOs by just flipping that switch.
Gotcha.
I would set it to ISO and not gain, because gain's more, I mean, they're basically the same thing, but digital. White balance, something we haven't talked about in this class. But white balance, you can preset them to A and B. The cool thing about white balance is that you can take a white piece of paper wherever you are, there should be, see the white balance set button here? You can take that, put it on A or B, and hold this button down with a white or a gray piece of paper in whatever environment you're shooting on, and it will lock itself to either the A or the B. Okay. You can switch to preset, and then within the menu, you can set to like tungsten or daylight or whatever you're doing. I would say like wherever you find, you're moving all over the place,
I'm
right?
moving all over the place,
Yeah, so I would set A to tungsten and B to daylight or something like that, and then that way you can just switch on the fly really fast. Okay. Just go hold pieces of paper where you're at. Sometimes the light's different in different countries and stuff like that. This full auto button is really interesting on the FS7. If you push and hold that, it'll make everything go full auto. Okay. Which means it'll select your f-stop, it'll select your ISO, it'll select your frame, it'll select not your frame rate, it'll select your shutter. It's just like a foolproof way. So if you're running and gunning, you didn't have time to set anything up, just push that button and it'll get you like an okay exposure. Okay. Just depends on what you're looking at. Obviously a record button up here. This is where you can get into all your menus and systems right here. This menu button here will let you pop the menu up here, and then this is weird for the F5, but this is how you select, and you push in on it to select something. There's soft keys here, so like you can kind of shift back and forth, left and right. The thumbnail version will get you to play back what you're previously looking at. Okay. So that's when you want to review stuff. You can push that and get into that mode. All this other stuff's like you can select shutter, you can select white balance, you can select ISO and gain, and that will open up while you're shooting, it'll open you up in there and you can kind of move around and push that. So here's a memory card slot. Sony does have their own cards, but we can talk more about that later. But you can see you got some nice big 128 gig cards. Those just go in, push in. You can put an SD card in, I think, to load your own settings or your own look if you like. It's a little kind of complicated. So that's good. Headphone jack to listen to the shotgun that you don't have on here. It's funny, I think the FS7 has an internal mic somewhere. Have you messed with that yet?
Not yet.
I believe it's like kind of hidden around here somewhere, but it does exist. That's it for this side of the camera. I feel like it's pretty good functionality. Here, your monitor is kind of cool in the FS7 because you can adjust your peaking for exposure and your zebras, or your peaking for focus and your zebras for exposure. You can turn it off and on there. Also, the contrast will help you look. I don't know if I trust this monitor for color, maybe for exposure, but I would really look at your zebras, and I believe you can pull up a histogram on here if you like. Your on-off switch is down here. It's always hidden. I always thought that was silly. I'll turn it on. And then your mirror, if you want to like flip this around or somewhere, you can kind of flip it around. The cool thing about the top of the FS7, which a lot of cameras typically do have nowadays, the C series do, and you can buy handles for like DSLRs and stuff, but you can hold it low and you can record from up here, or you can put it on hold. And when you have a servo, you don't have a servo lens here, but you can zoom in, zoom out. You can put a hot shoe light up there if you wanted to, or a different mic. The FS7 has this weird grip thing going on here with their monitor, and then you can put a shotgun mic up here. On this side, it looks like we've got more audio inputs, and we do have audio stuff over here. We can go back over there and look at it. But are you using a shotgun mic or wireless mics or something like that?
I will be using a shotgun mic, yes.
Cool, yeah. So you would just you put it up here and you run it down here, and then you can adjust line in mic. I'm really bad at that type of stuff, but it is important to know if you're doing dock run and gun stuff. You can do mic that needs power, or if your thing has power, you can switch it over. You're not using any monitors, but typically if you're sending out a monitor on set, you can send a SDI out to a director or to your first AC or to a nicer, better monitor up here. This is where you'd come out of there. Typically, DSLRs don't have that, but bigger cameras will. Yeah, man, I feel like that's pretty good. Back to the audio, here's the board. You can put it on auto, but sometimes it like doesn't look as nice or doesn't sound as nice. Or you can go into manual and then you can physically adjust the levels of it. It's cool that they have this door on it to kind of protect you from messing with it, but you can push in and like spin if you had to. So it looks just really quickly on your settings that you want to go over to check. Remember, so this camera shoots 4K, so you're actually at 496 by 2160. I don't know if you're going to shoot 4K on the day, but that's going to eat up. You got nice big cards, so you should be fine. Your frame rate's here, it's 2997. All this information is typically on every camera. It'll tell you on the display what you're looking at, so you can tell what frame rate you're at, 29.7, what resolution, 4096 by 2160, the amount of battery left, your white balance. Then you have no GPS signal. Some of these cameras you can set up to have GPS, which is odd. There's no sound levels because we don't have it set to internal mics. I think if I actually put it here, you might pick something up. Yeah, see, no. We'll deal with that later. You have time code. TCG is time code generator. It looks like you're in record mode. You can do free run if you want, but record mode, since it's just you, it's probably fine. It has, you have your, what do you call it, the shake off, like it'll do reduction, movement reduction, but not with this lens. And then you just have a whole bunch of other information that isn't necessarily important. You have a fourth ND in. It'll tell you on the screen, so that's with it out. So it'll tell you clear, it's on standby, so we're not rolling. For some reason, you get 1/500th of a shutter, which is a little odd. You can change that. It looks like it's on auto, so it's doing that for you. But yeah, you'd have to go in and adjust that. And then your cards here tells you how much you have left. A lot of cool stuff, man. I think a really cool thing about the FS7 is that you've got here, I can try to pull this around, you've got like a whole remote system here. With one hand, you can record, you can go through the menus, you can set these buttons to be what you want. If you had a servo, you could use this zooming and zooming out. And then this will adjust the f-stop. There's a slider button up here. Okay, so hopefully this was super helpful for you. I know this is like a different camera than most people are going to be using, but I just wanted to kind of go over this general points of a camera. And all cameras tend to have similar things that you need to be looking for.